Messiah. But that's not what Isaiah is talking about. He's talking about the return of the Jewish people from captivity and being comforted. And it's all through there. You just read it carefully and without your preconception. Just read what Isaiah is saying, and you'll say that someone has taken this all out of context and applied it to a total other event, which is fair enough. That's what people did with biblical exegesis. But that's what I mean about taking things out of context. Look at the context, and you will know that the big event, why the messengers are on the high mountains, are fleet of foot, why highways are being drawn up in the desert, why water is being put in the desert, and so on, which is reinterpreted in esoteric, allegorical way later on in terms of baptism and so on. But in Isaiah, it's so that the people can return across the desert from Iraq to Palestine in the wake of this rescript of Cyrus. And I know it's boring and it's not as exciting as to have someone born in a manger and have Handel putting all this to music. But in fact, that's the humdrum thing that Isaiah is about. So it doesn't have the secondary meaning about that. Nowhere in the whole of Isaiah will you see a secondary meaning about the meaning that's given. What about the suffering servant? Suffering servant, if you read it carefully, is the whole people of Israel. I mean, who have suffered all these trials after they, I know it's not going to do a world religion, so don't worry, it's no threat. But it's not going to, go anywhere. But the point of it is, you read it, you'll see it. Well, didn't it have a secondary meaning? Well, you can put a secondary meaning to anything, even to what I'm saying. But did the prophet Isaiah mean a secondary meaning? No, I don't think so. And it even looks like that the ruler who came back in the first captivity, Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel sounds like a weird name. It really means shoot out of David, born in Babylon. But to us it's Zerubbabel or something like that. Babel is Babylon, and Zeru means shoot. It's a Davidic family member a descendant who led the return under Cyrus and came to a bad end because history doesn't know where he is. Drops out. Probably he was executed. Maybe he's the suffering servant in Isaiah. Because the point is that something bad happens to him. Because he drops out, and by the time we come back into the picture, we don't have any Davidic leaders at all. A century later, we're in the period of Ezra and Nehemiah, and now we've only got priests. Both Ezra and Nehemiah, particularly Ezra, are priests. Nehemiah is a eunuch, so it's not clear. It should be this way, I guess. Nehemiah. But these are in the mid-400s. And it turns out that the returnees in the 500s hadn't done much. Hadn't built the walls, hadn't really gotten far with the temple, were the prey to all kinds of foreign tribes that were, raiding them. And then Ezra sends back, or Nehemiah sends back Ezra. It's not clear what the relationship of the two, even if Ezra is really historical. But Nehemiah has influence at the court, and he's a cupbearer, meaning anyone at the Persian court would be a eunuch. So he would certainly be someone who could not be a priest or something. So he would need a representative, because you couldn't have a physical blemish if you were a priest. Anyway, at that point, they start to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and the temple, and that's the Second Temple period. Then we go to a dark hole, as I told you. Next thing we end up with, Alexander the Great, 333, as I told you. Then down into the war against Hellenistic control, particularly the Seleucids, who are in neighboring Syria. I told you that Alexander's empire was divided up into 4 parts. The general Seleucus and his descendants got the area around Syria. The general Ptolemy, the last descendant of whom was Cleopatra, got the area around Egypt. And they were called the Ptolemies. And there were 2 other generals who got Asia Minor and mainland Greece. That's the 4 winds of Daniel, of the 4 parts of the descendants of the great hairy he-goat that comes out of the west and conquers the world, if you've read the book of Daniel. Anyway, down in the Maccabean period, you have this uprising. So for a time, you have Jewish independence. 175 BC. Hanukkah, as we said, celebrates that. And then the Romans come. So the Romans come under Caesar's colleague, Pompey. He's the conqueror in the east. Caesar's the conqueror in the west. They have what's called a triumvirate. There's a third guy who's in the middle who they finally fall out with. And then they fall out with each other. But these dates are pretty clear. Pompey, it's in Josephus now very clearly, and you can read Josephus, takes Jerusalem in 63 BC. He assaults Jerusalem and takes it. And by that time the Jewish polity is split. There are two groups competing with control. So the Jews only have real independence for how long? 100 years. 100 years. And then they're back under Roman control. And part of the split is in the Maccabean family itself. You can find all this in Josephus, but I'll summarize it for you. Two brothers fall out with each other. One is called Aristobulus. They've taken Greek names by this time. Actually, his Hebrew name is Judah, or Judas. And the other, Hyrcanus. I forget what his name is. I think it's John. That's why you get all these names in the New Testament, like John, Judas, Simon. These are all Maccabean names. The Maccabean names of Maccabean leaders, rulers, kings. Mary, the last Maccabean princess, was named what? Miriam, Herod's wife. That's why you get all the Marys in the New Testament. Just like people today name themselves after famous figures, people then did too. So, by that time, Miriam, and shows you their affections. If you don't name someone after someone if you don't like that person. So since all the Christian characters are Maccabean names, including Lazarus, which is Eleazar, which is one of the names of one of the Maccabean brothers and so on, you don't name after people if you don't have affection for them. So the Christian characters are all in the tradition of Jewish revolutionary nationalism. And that's something that is just not understood by people who don't do the history. So right away the history helps you. Okay, so Mary is just a shorting of Mariam, Miriam. In Arabic it's Maryam, and so on and so forth. So that's pretty straightforward. So Pompey, there's a split here among these two brothers. He's the older brother, so he's the high priest. They were priest kings by this time. They'd taken both priesthood because they were priestly family and kingship. And they argue and fight with each other, and Aristobulus defeated him. And he's supported by the Pharisees, who actually come into existence at that time. And he's supported by nationalist zealots, whom we don't know what they're called. Zealots, if you like. They haven't been called zealots yet. Sadducees